I heard them decide my fate through a door that was not fully closed. It was a fate wrapped in the crisp rustle of my stepmother's silk and the dull, defeated sigh of my father's assent. They spoke of me not as a daughter, but as a piece of furniture that had become inconvenient, an item to be stored away in the attic of our crumbling fortunes, so that the more valuable pieces, namely my sister Rosamond, could be displayed to their best advantage. I was plain, they said, a shadow that clung too closely to Rosamond's sun. I was too quiet, too fond of books, and possessed a gravity of expression that did little to recommend me. And so I was to be dispatched to Blackwood Manor's most remote tenant cottage, a place left to decay on the very edge of the Duke's vast estate, while they moved into a rented townhouse closer to the social whirl, all in the hope of snaring the Duke himself for Rosamond. My existence, it seemed, was a strategic inconvenience. I did not weep. I had learnt long ago that my tears were a currency with no value in my father's house. Instead, I stood there, a silent observer of my own dismantling, my hand resting on the cool wood of the hallway panelling. I felt a strange sense of detachment, as if I were reading about a character in one of my books, a poor, overlooked governess whose future was being arranged by others. The only difference was that this story was my own, and there was no guarantee of a happy ending written into the final chapter. I packed my few belongings, my books, my mother's silver locket, and a small, crudely carved wooden horse my late brother had made for me, into a single trunk. I did not protest, for I knew it would be as useless as arguing with the tide. The cottage was precisely as I had imagined it, a stone husk held together by ivy and memory. It was damp, and the air inside was thick with the scent of wet earth and forgotten fires. A thin grey light filtered through the grimy window panes, illuminating a world of dust motes dancing in solemn procession. My stepmother had called it rustication, a gentle term for exile. She had framed it as a kindness, a chance for me to enjoy the country air, far from the pressures of society. I knew it for what it was, a banishment. I was the inconvenient truth of our family's decline, the plain daughter who served as a constant, unflattering comparison to Rosamond's lauded beauty. They needed a pristine stage for their performance, and I was a flaw in the scenery. For weeks I lived in a state of suspended animation. My days were measured not by the clock, but by the slow crawl of light across the bare floorboards. I cleaned the cottage until my hands were raw, coaxed a reluctant flame from the hearth, and spent my evenings reading by the wavering candlelight, the words a fragile shield against the encroaching silence. The solitude was a strange companion. At times it was a cold and heavy cloak, and at others a quiet, liberating peace. Here, at least, I was not being measured and found wanting. I was simply present. I was a creature of the woods and the rain-swept fields, as much a part of the landscape as the ancient oaks that stood sentinel at the edge of the property. The Duke of Blackwood was a name spoken in hushed, reverent tones in my former home. He was a myth, a figure of immense wealth and power, rendered more fascinating by his reclusiveness. It was said he was still in mourning for his late wife, who had died years ago, and that his heart was a fortress no one could breach. He was the grand prize, the solution to my family's mountain of debt, and Rosamond was the beautiful, perfect key they intended to use on that formidable lock. I thought of him as one might think of a distant storm cloud, a powerful, unknowable force that had altered the climate of my life without my ever having seen the lightning. And then, one rain-lashed afternoon, the storm arrived at my door. A furious downpour had turned the world outside into a blur of grey and green, and I was huddled by the fire, mending a tear in my only good shawl, when a loud, insistent knock echoed through the small cottage. It was a sound so alien in my quiet world that I froze, my needle poised in mid-air. No one ever came to this forgotten corner of the estate. Hesitantly, I unlatched the heavy wooden door and found him standing on my threshold. The Duke of Blackwood. He was taller than I had imagined, a severe, imposing figure, cloaked in darkness against the raging storm. Rainwater streamed from the brim of his hat and dripped from the shoulders of his greatcoat. His face was all sharp angles and shadows, his expression unreadable, but his eyes, they were a startling, piercing grey, the colour of the winter sea. He looked at the humble cottage, then at me, and a flicker of something, annoyance perhaps, or confusion, crossed his features.
"I was told this was the gamekeeper's lodge,"
he said, his voice a low, resonant baritone that seemed to vibrate in the very air between us.
"My horse has thrown a shoe."
I found my own voice, a thin and reedy thing. "The gamekeeper's lodge is a mile farther east, Your Grace. This is my home." I did not know why I called it that. It was my prison, my exile. But in that moment, faced with this powerful intruder, it felt like the only thing in the world that was mine to defend. He did not apologise for the intrusion, he simply studied me. It was not the polite, dismissive sweep of a glance I was accustomed to, the kind that took in my plain brown dress and unremarkable face before moving on to something more interesting. It was a direct, analytical gaze, sharp and unsettlingly focused. He looked at me as if I were a puzzle, a misplaced sentence in a familiar text. It was the first time a man of his station, or any man at all, had ever truly looked at me, and the intensity of it was like a physical touch. I felt a strange, unwelcome warmth rise in my cheeks. This was the first look, though I would not understand its significance until much later. It was the moment the script my family had written was irrevocably torn. "You are soaked through," I managed, stepping back to allow him entry. It was an automatic, ingrained courtesy, but the sight of him filling the small, cramped space of my cottage was jarring. He was a creature of grand halls and sweeping vistas, and here he was, dripping onto my worn stone floor, his presence overwhelming the room. He removed his hat, revealing dark hair threaded with a surprising touch of silver at the temples, though he could not have been much past 30. The lines around his eyes spoke not of age, but of sorrow or intense concentration. He refused my offer of a dry blanket, standing instead by the hearth, his gaze sweeping over my meagre possessions. It rested for a long moment on the small stack of books on the mantelpiece, a volume of Pope, a collection of Greek tragedies, a well-worn copy of Shakespeare's sonnets. His expression did not change, but I saw a subtle shift in his posture, a slight easing of the tension in his shoulders. He was a man who recognised the language of books, and it was, perhaps, the first thing about me that made any sense to him. We stood in silence for a long time, the only sounds the crackle of the fire and the drumming of the rain against the roof. It was a strange, charged silence, a quiet negotiation of space and status. I, the banished daughter in a forgotten cottage, and he, the Duke who owned the very ground beneath my feet. Eventually, the rain lessened to a soft drizzle, and he prepared to leave. At the door, he turned back, his grey eyes fixing on me once more. "You have insufficient firewood for a storm of this length," he stated. It was not an observation, it was a verdict. Then, with a curt nod, he was gone, disappearing back into the bruised twilight. I stood at the open door long after he had vanished, the cold, damp air doing little to cool the lingering heat of his presence. I did not know it then, but that awkward, rain-drenched encounter was the beginning of everything. It was the first stone cast into the still, stagnant pool of my life, and the ripples would change its shape forever. 2 days later, a cart arrived from the main house. It was laden with a small mountain of neatly chopped, seasoned oak and birch, enough to last me through the winter and beyond. The estate worker who delivered it touched his cap, mumbled something about the Duke's orders, and left before I could properly respond. I stared at the wood, a perfect, symmetrical pyre of unsolicited charity. My first instinct was a fierce hot flush of pride. I did not want his pity. I did not want to be a project, a poor tenant to be managed with impersonal benevolence. Kindness from the powerful, I had learned, often came with invisible invoices, and I had no currency with which to pay. I considered sending it back, but the absurdity of such a gesture stopped me. How did one return a cartload of firewood? So I stacked it, my resentment warring with the practical knowledge that my own meagre pile of damp kindling would not have lasted another week. Each log I carried felt like a concession, an acceptance of a debt I could not repay. A week after the firewood, a second delivery arrived. This time it was a small, unmarked crate left on my doorstep. Inside, nestled in soft wool, was a shawl. It was not a grand or ostentatious thing, but it was made of the finest, softest cashmere, in a deep shade of forest green, and it was warmer than anything I had ever owned. I remembered shivering in my thin, mended shawl during his visit, and I knew, with a sinking certainty, that he had noticed that as well. He had noticed everything. This was his second act of secret kindness, and it felt even more intrusive than the first. It was personal. I packed it back into its crate and paid a boy from the village to return it to the manor with a short, formal note. "Your Grace is too kind," I wrote, the words stiff and ungracious. "I am quite comfortable and have no need of such a gift." It was a lie, of course. My shoulders ached with a constant chill, and the luxurious softness of the wool had been a siren's call to my cold skin. But my pride was a thin, brittle armour, and it was all I had. The following week, a book arrived. It was a slim volume of poetry by a little-known Italian author, bound in dark blue leather. It was not a book one found easily. I had mentioned it in passing to the village vicar, lamenting that I'd only ever read excerpts. The vicar was a kindly old man who allowed me to help catalogue the parish library, a small, dusty room that had become my only sanctuary. I had not known the Duke was a patron of the parish. I had not known he ever spoke to the vicar at all. The realization that he had sought out this information, that he had listened to the echoes of my quietest desires, was profoundly unsettling. It felt like a violation, a quiet siege on the carefully constructed walls of my solitude. This gift, too, I returned. My note was even shorter this time. Thank you, but I cannot accept. I felt a perverse satisfaction in these small acts of defiance. I was refusing to be a character in his narrative of ducal charity. I would not be the grateful, shivering maiden rescued by the powerful lord. My refusals did not deter him. They seemed, instead, to change his strategy. He began to appear at the parish library on the afternoons I was there. He never announced his visits. He would simply be there, standing among the shadowed shelves, ostensibly searching for a book on estate management or agricultural reform. The vicar, flustered and honoured by the ducal presence, would flutter around him, but the Duke's attention, I soon realised, was directed elsewhere. He would ask me questions, his voice low and formal, about the cataloguing system I had devised. He would inquire after a specific text, his finger tracing the spine of a book near where my hand rested. Our conversations began as stilted exchanges about Dewey and Descartes, but they slowly, cautiously deepened. He spoke of his travels, of the libraries he had seen in Vienna and Rome, and I, forgetting my station, forgetting my resentment, would respond with an eagerness I had not felt in years. We talked of philosophy and poetry, of the Stoics and the Romantics. In those conversations, I was not the plain, invisible daughter of a feckless baron. I was a mind, an equal intellect, and the experience was so intoxicating, it frightened me. He listened to my opinions with that same unnerving, focused intensity I had seen on the day we first met. He did not patronise me. He challenged me. He disagreed with me. He saw me. One afternoon, as we stood in a narrow aisle, the air thick with the scent of old paper and leather, our hands brushed as we both reached for the same volume of Virgil. It was the briefest of touches, skin against skin, but a jolt went through me, sharp and electric. I pulled my hand back as if burned. He did not. His gaze met mine over the top of the book, and for a moment, the library, the world, seemed to fade away, leaving only the charged space between us. His grey eyes were no longer cold or severe. They held a warmth, a question, a vulnerability that mirrored my own. "Eleonora," he said, and the sound of my Christian name on his lips was a seismic event. It was a breach of every rule of propriety, a dismantling of the formal distance between a duke and a baron's daughter. "I would ask you to call me Alistair." My heart hammered against my ribs. To use his name would be to accept an intimacy I was not prepared for, to step across a line from which there was no return. It was an offering, and it was a test. I looked at him, at this powerful, grieving, complicated man who saw past my plain face to the contents of my mind, and I knew my small war of returned gifts was over. I had been fighting to keep him out, but the truth was, he had already breached my defences. "Alistair," I whispered, and the name felt both foreign and familiar on my tongue. It was a surrender and a victory all at once. That tentative peace, however, was built on a foundation I did not understand, and it was destined to shatter. The catalyst arrived in the form of a letter, delivered not to me, but mistakenly tucked into a parcel of linens sent from my family's townhouse. It was from my stepmother to my father, her script a vicious, elegant slash across the page. I knew I should not read it, but my name, caught in the middle of a sentence, snagged my attention. I read it standing in the cold morning light of my kitchen, and the words bled the warmth from the room, from my very bones. The letter was a tapestry of desperation and greed. It detailed their debts, which were even more staggering than I had imagined, and it named their primary creditor, the Duke of Blackwood. Alistair. My father had, it seemed, leveraged everything against the Duke's fortune, and the marriage of Rosamond to him was not a hope, but a contractual obligation. It was a business transaction designed to save them from utter ruin. My banishment had been part of the strategy to remove any distractions. But the letter went on, my stepmother's tone turning venomous. The Duke was proving difficult. He was spending his time at the parish library. He was showing an inexplicable and perverse interest in me, the plain one. She urged my father to put a stop to it, to remind me of my place, to ensure I did not jeopardize their only chance of salvation. Every kindness he had ever shown me was instantly recontextualized, twisted into something ugly and manipulative. The firewood, the shawl, the book, our conversations, were they all just part of a larger, crueler game? Was he merely toying with me, the inconvenient sister, while waiting to close the deal on the beautiful one? The trust I had so cautiously begun to build crumbled into dust, leaving behind a bitter, choking ash of humiliation. I felt like a fool, a naive country mouse lured by a piece of cheese, only to find the trap's spring poised to snap. The man who had made me feel seen had, in fact, been watching me as one might watch a pawn on a chessboard. I did not wait. I did not think. Fueled by a cold, white-hot rage, I walked the 3 miles to Blackwood Manor, my stepmother's letter clutched in my hand like a weapon. I did not ask for an audience. I demanded one. The butler, a man who looked as ancient and immovable as the house itself, regarded me with startled disapproval. But there must have been something in my eyes, a wildness he dared not challenge, because he led me, not to a formal receiving room, but to the Duke's private library. It was a room that would have been my heaven under any other circumstances. It was vast and warm, lined from floor to ceiling with thousands of books, the air fragrant with the scent of leather and beeswax. A fire roared in a marble fireplace, and long slanted ribbons of light from the tall windows illuminated the space. Alistair was standing by a globe, a book open in his hand. He looked up as I entered, and a slow, genuine smile transformed his severe features. "Eleonora," he said, his voice full of a warmth that now felt like a lie. "I was just thinking of you." The smile died on his lips when he saw my face. I said nothing. I simply walked to the grand mahogany desk that dominated the centre of the room and laid the letter upon it. He watched me, his expression hardening back into a guarded mask. He picked up the letter and read it, his face betraying nothing. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. "So you know," he said at last, his voice flat. He did not look at me. He looked out the window at the manicured lawns that stretched to the horizon. "I know that I'm a pawn in a game I was not even aware I was playing," I said, my voice shaking with a fury I could no longer contain. "I know that my family is selling my sister to you to settle a debt. And I know that your attention, your kindness, was all a lie. A calculated part of this sordid transaction. Was I an amusement? A diversion? Did you take pleasure in seeing how easily the plain, bookish spinster could be flattered?" He turned from the window then, and the look in his eyes stopped the torrent of my accusations. It was not guilt, not arrogance, but a deep, profound pain, a weariness that seemed to settle into his very bones.
"The debt is real," he admitted, his voice quiet. "The initial arrangement concerning your sister, that was also real. It was a cold, practical solution to a problem conceived by your father and mine long ago. I inherited the agreement along with the title.
I had no intention of honouring the spirit of it, but I felt bound by duty to see it through in some form. He took a step toward me, his hands held open in a gesture of supplication. "But you, Eleonora," he said, his voice dropping to a raw, earnest whisper, "you were the catastrophe I did not plan for. You were the flaw in the logic, the unexpected variable that changed the entire equation. Nothing about you has been a lie." "How can I believe that?" I choked out, wrapping my arms around myself as if to hold my shattered pride together. "Every gift, every conversation, it is all tainted by this." "Then let me untaint it," he said, his gaze intense and unwavering. "I knew of your family's plan to send you away. I knew they considered you an inconvenience. My first visit to your cottage was not an accident. I told myself I was inspecting my property, but I was looking for you. I wanted to see the woman they thought so little of. And what I found was you, standing in the doorway of that wreck of a house, proud and defiant, and utterly unimpressed by my title. You looked at me as if I were nothing more than a nuisance dripping water on your floor." A faint, wry smile touched his lips.
"It was the most honest reaction I have had from anyone in a decade," he continued, his voice resonating with a conviction that began to chip away at my anger. "I sent the firewood because you were cold. I sent the shawl because you were shivering. I sent the book because I could not bear the thought of your mind having nothing to feast on. When you returned them, I was frustrated and intrigued. No one had ever refused me anything. So I came to the library. I came to talk to you, to listen to you. And every moment I spent with you, the original, cold contract became more and more unthinkable. You spoke of truth and honour, and I was living a lie.
Your presence held up a mirror to me, and I did not like the man I saw." He revealed then that he had already acted. He had met with his solicitors the week before. He had restructured my father's debt into a manageable loan with generous terms, completely severing the marriage clause. A copy of the new agreement had been sent to my father that very morning. "Your sister is free, Eleonora," he said softly, "and so am I." He had done this without telling me, a proactive defence not of his interests, but of my honour and my sister's future. It was a secret kindness far greater than any shawl or book. He closed the distance between us, his presence no longer overwhelming, but a source of strange, grounding comfort. I have spent the last 5 years in a grey world, Eleonora. A world of duty and memory and endless, silent corridors. I did my duty. I managed my grief. I existed. I did not live. And then I met you, and it was as if a window had been thrown open in a room that had been sealed for years. You are not a diversion. You are the destination. You are in my every thought. You have unmade me. This was his vulnerable confession, a raw and powerful declaration that stripped away the ducal armour and showed me the man beneath. The earnestness in his voice, the undisguised emotion in his eyes, it was a truth I felt in the marrow of my bones. The anger drained out of me, replaced by a slow, deep, and shaking hope. I saw the honourable, lonely man behind the severe facade, a man who had been just as trapped by duty as I had been by circumstance. I did not need to speak. He saw the acceptance in my eyes. We had moved beyond the crisis, beyond the secret, and formed an alliance built not on a contract, but on a shared, dawning truth. We were two solitary souls who had, against all odds, found a matching quiet in one another. Our newfound peace was, of course, a declaration of war to my family. When my stepmother received the solicitor's letter outlining the new financial arrangement, and a polite but firm note from Alistair ending any and all discussion of a match with Rosamond, her fury was incandescent. She saw her grand ambitions turning to ash, and she blamed me. She and my father descended upon the next local assembly, a grand affair held at the estate of a neighbouring earl, with the express purpose of destroying me. They found me standing with Alistair near a set of French doors that opened onto a cool, moonlit terrace. My stepmother, her face a mask of righteous indignation, bore down on us like a ship in full sail. "There you are, you wicked, conniving girl," she hissed, her voice low enough to be a private threat, but loud enough for those nearby to turn and stare. "Seducing the Duke, ruining your sister's chances, bringing shame upon us all. You were always a jealous, grasping creature." My father stood behind her, his expression a miserable blend of bluster and shame. "Eleonora, you will come home at once," he commanded. "This entanglement ends now. The Duke has been misled by your arts." A hush fell over our corner of the ballroom. Faces turned towards us, alight with the cruel glee of impending scandal. In the past, I would have shrunk. I would have withered under their accusations, my silence taken as an admission of guilt. But standing beside Alistair, feeling the quiet, steady strength of his presence, I found a courage I never knew I possessed. This was my moment. I would not be a shadow any longer. I looked my stepmother directly in the eye, my voice calm and clear, cutting through the sudden silence. "I have seduced no one, madam, and the only shame brought upon our name comes from your own avarice. You sought to sell my sister like livestock, to settle debts you and my father accrued through vanity and poor judgment." A collective gasp went through the assembled onlookers. My stepmother's face went pale, then mottled with rage. "How dare you! The Duke knows of our agreement. He will tell you she lies." But Alistair did not move. He simply looked down at her with an expression of icy disdain. "The only agreement I recognise, Lady Beaumont," he said, his voice carrying with effortless authority across the room, "is the one my solicitor has just finalised with your husband. A generous loan, which I expect to be repaid. The matter of a marriage contract was a distasteful fiction of your own creation, one I have taken legal steps to permanently dissolve." He then produced a small packet of letters from his coat pocket. "I also have here your correspondence with my late father,
in which you quite baldly outline your scheme.
I believe the term you used was securing the Blackwood fortune at any cost. I doubt your other creditors would be pleased to learn of your methods. The evidence was irrefutable. The letters, the solicitor, the Duke's own testimony. It was a public dismantling of their entire social standing. My stepmother looked from the letters in his hand to the ring of horrified, fascinated faces around her, and for the first time I saw her composure crack. My father simply looked at the floor, a man utterly and finally defeated. Their downfall was swift and absolute. The whispers that followed them as they made their hasty, humiliating retreat were the death knell of their social lives. In the aftermath, as the buzz of conversation slowly resumed around us, Alistair turned to me. He did not say a word. He simply offered me his arm. I took it, and he led me away from the prying eyes, out onto the quiet, stone-flagged terrace. The cool night air was a balm after the heat of the confrontation. We walked in silence to the edge of the balustrade, the silver light of the moon illuminating the formal gardens below. He turned to face me, taking both of my hands in his. "You were magnificent, Eleonora," he said, his voice filled with a quiet awe. "I only spoke the truth," I whispered, my heart still beating a frantic rhythm against my ribs. "Your truth has more strength than 1,000 lies," he replied. He looked down at our joined hands, then back up at my face. The severity, the grief, the caution, it was all gone from his expression. In its place was a look of such open, tender adoration that it stole the breath from my lungs. "I have been sending you the wrong gifts," he said softly. "I sent you things, wood, wool, paper and ink, but those are not what I truly wished to give you." "What then?" I asked, my voice barely audible. He did not answer with words. He gently released one of my hands and reached into his waistcoat pocket, pulling out a small, familiar object. It was my little wooden horse, the one my brother had carved for me so many years ago. I had left it on the mantel in my haste and desperation when I had fled the cottage to confront him. One of its legs had been broken for years, a tiny splintered thing. He had mended it. The repair was almost invisible, a work of delicate, patient care. He had taken this small, worthless, broken piece of my past and made it whole. He placed it in my palm, his fingers closing over mine. "I offer you this," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "My patience, my protection, my quiet, my home, my heart, Eleonora. It is all I have of any real value. Will you accept it?" Tears welled in my eyes, but they were not the bitter, worthless tears of my youth. They were tears of profound, overwhelming joy. I could not speak. I simply nodded, clutching the small wooden horse as if it were the most precious jewel in the world. And then, under the light of 1,000 distant stars, he lowered his head and kissed me. It was not a kiss of frantic passion, but one of slow, deep, and shaking reverence. It was a promise, a homecoming, a final, beautiful resolution to all the silent, lonely chapters that had come before. It was the end of my exile and the beginning of my life. We were married 3 months later, in the small parish church where we had first truly spoken. Rosamond was there, genuinely happy for me. Freed from the weight of our parents' ambitions, she had found a quiet joy of her own, accepting the suit of a respectable country gentleman who loved her for her gentle spirit, not her face or her connections. My father and stepmother did not attend. They had retired to Bath in disgrace. Our life at Blackwood Manor was not one of grand balls and endless society. It was a life of shared quiet and profound connection. It was long walks through the rain-swept fields, our hands intertwined. It was evenings spent in the great library, reading aloud to one another by the fire, our feet tangled together. It was the simple, extraordinary pleasure of being truly and completely seen by the person you loved. Alistair's laughter, once so rare, became a frequent and welcome sound in the halls of the manor. He taught me how to manage the estate, valuing my keen mind and practical insights. I, in turn, helped him fill the house not just with books, but with warmth and light, chasing away the last of the grey shadows from his heart. Sometimes I would stand on the grand terrace, looking out over the lands that were now my home, and I would think of the girl in the damp, lonely cottage. She had believed herself to be a forgotten footnote in someone else's story. She had not known that her quiet strength, her resilient heart, and her love for the truth were not flaws to be hidden, but were in fact the very qualities that would lead her to a love greater than she had ever dared to imagine. The little wooden horse sat on the mantelpiece in our bedroom, a constant reminder that even broken things can be mended, and that the greatest gifts are not the ones that can be bought, but the ones that are patiently, lovingly, and honourably given. I had come home.